All right. Hi there, Epidemics. Hope everybody's doing well today. Have you guys managed to find the bird?
I think I have.
Where is it? Like that's an easy thing to describe.
It's like it's toward the right of the tree.
Yep, it's
Right there.
there. So head's here, body here, tail there. Yep. Okay. So there is a quiz this week on the plague. It's due Sunday, April 10th before midnight. The journal entry this week is a little bit different than what we've been doing. So I want you to read the instructions carefully. I'm going to ask you guys to spend half an hour not on your phone, but somewhere where you can observe the natural world. So it can be, if you've got a backyard with trees and bushes and that kind of stuff, it can be there, it can be a park, it can be the beach. Where doesn't matter. But I'm going to want you to write up what you observe. And of course, a reminder, the project will be due before midnight on Sunday, May 1st, and presentations will be on the 26th and the 28th. All right. Next Tuesday, there will be no class. I'm looking at possibilities for things to have you guys read or a video for you guys to watch instead of coming to class. And the material in whatever I find as a class substitute will be on the quiz next week. Okay, so we've been talking about the second plague pandemic, and we were talking about quarantining and sanitary cordons and the early development of public health. Does anybody have any questions on what we've been talking about? Okay, so we're going to continue talking about early public health. Generally, these were called something like the Board of Health or health magistrates, which is a fancy word for a type of police officer. And when the plague would enter a large city, and it would, the sanitary cordons didn't really work. People can get past those. There will always be people who can slip across borders or smuggle other people across borders. The quarantines helped reduce plague coming into some places, but it didn't completely eliminate it. So what happened when plague got into a community? So it varied dramatically from location to location. So you could have some areas where the sick were sent to lazarettos. Remember what lazarettos are? Nope. Those are structures that were built to house people under quarantine. Or they would be sent to places called pest houses. which were kind of hospitals, but the care was not great. And very few returned from these isolations. A lot of people considered this confinement to basically be a death sentence. So this confinement of any kind had to be enforced by armed guards because people would try and escape. There were severe penalties for escape attempts. These confinements were really hard financially as well, because the patients were charged for room and board. Kind of like modern hospitals in the US, right? They charge you for everything they can come up with to charge you. And if you don't have insurance, congratulations, you're bankrupt. You know, we haven't gotten past that in this country. A lot of other countries have gotten past that. In addition, because there were armed guards enforcing people to stay in these areas, some of these sites also doubled as prisons. So not only were the sick people being kept here, but so were healthy people who had committed some kind of crime. The boards of health would hire searchers to find the sick and the dead. So they were literally hiring people to go around and find the sick, take them to the lazarettos, find the dead, and take them to mass burials. Well, who do you think wanted these jobs or would do these jobs?
The poor?
The poor, exactly. So you're not going to get particularly nice people doing this. And so these searchers had the authority to enter houses. So they could come into your house and look for sick people. They knew they were being potentially exposed to plague, so they were amped up, kind of, you know, stressed, a little bit angry kind of people. Many of them fortified themselves with alcohol.
Oh, bounty hunters.
They were like bounty hunters, yes. And bribery and thieving were common. Not surprised. You've got poor people who don't want to be doing this job, so they're going to take advantage of the situations, and a lot of times they're drunk. So stealing stuff, taking bribes, very, very common. Okay, so this is a good spot for screenshotting. So this was kind of one extreme. The other extreme, we called them hot plague hospitals rather than pest houses, because patients were actually supported. Medically, religiously, a lot of these were religious places, and emotionally. More like what we would all like if we were stuck in a plague hospital. These were often philanthropic, which means wealthy people funded these. And again, Venice led the way. They would hire a prior who would be the head of the hospital. The prior must be married. He cared for adults. His wife would care for the children. So if you were married to somebody who got appointed the prior, you were stuck taking care of sick kids, whether you wanted to or not. They also had carters to carry corpses. So you guys, well, Jerry, you might have seen the Monty Python sketch, Bring Out Your Dead. That was based on something that was really happening. The carts had bells to warn the public. And during major outbreaks, the number of dead would really go up dramatically. And so then we would see the mass graves or the mass funeral pyres. Even though the plague came again and again and again, this happened over and over and over, major outbreaks often caught places unprepared. The quarantine, if they had, taken the pest houses or the lazarettos and started using them for something else, like, I don't know, food storage, then here comes the plague again. And you might be quarantining people in their own houses. If you quarantine somebody in their own house, the family was included. So the whole family would be quarantined. They would post a guard. They'd mark the house with a red cross. Jerry, I see your hand up.
And in this era, everyone didn't have their own bedroom. So it was more like a big ass room that everyone else was in.
Yes.
Living room really was the living room.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of times the living room was also the bedroom for at least some of the household. A lot of times, if you were quarantined, nobody would bring you food or medical care. So it was kind of like, if you didn't have enough food in the house, you were in a lot of trouble. And again, mass graves, because they didn't have enough space and enough people to bury all the dead. Well, what do you think how do you think people responded to these really hard difficult efforts to stop these outbreaks?
Some bounty hunters got shot, or I don't know if they had guns then, stabbed.
Yeah, certainly. But we're seeing a lot of similar things going on today, like riots.
Yeah, true.
Concealing cases, trying to keep it a secret. We see this. We see, especially early in the COVID pandemic, a lot of death certificates would not list COVID as the cause of death. There were whole counties where nobody was dying of COVID. They were all dying. More people were dying, but they were dying of, anything else the coroner happened to want to put on the death certificate. We're not seeing riots in the US, but you may have heard there was a big trucker convoy to protest mask mandates, which are largely eliminated in most parts of the country. There are lots of people who are protesting and complaining about having to wear masks. There was a lack of helpful information. Sounds familiar. In 1896, towards the end of the second plague pandemic, in what was then called Bombay, which is now called Mumbai, there was an outbreak. Started in October. By December, half the population had fled. And a lot of the reasons they fled was because they were afraid of martial law. They were afraid the police would come in and quarantine them in their houses, leave them to starve to death, all of the kinds of stuff we've been talking about here. What happened? They carried the plague with them to nearby communities. So, okay, just a little bit more. So screenshot this. So the results of these early public health efforts. Not that great. Cities still got affected by the plague, and there was a loss of community, loss of family bonds. Churches closed, economic activity halted, no shopping. There was hunger, there was bankruptcy, although at the time it was just called economic ruin because it wasn't really, bankruptcy is a specific concept. And there was an increase in authoritarian rule, unless the government was destroyed or fled. What are we seeing with COVID? Have you gone out hanging out with your friends lately?
No, not me.
Not me either. Have you been doing a lot of shopping? I'm certainly not going out to the mall. Online.
And they drop the package off and they don't ring your bell, and that makes me angry. I don't understand that. Like, ring my damn bell, please.
Are we seeing problems with our economy?
Yeah, we're about to go into recession, possibly.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Interest going up.
Basically, something like 2/3 of Americans couldn't pay for a $1,000 emergency.
Damn.
2/3 of Americans don't have $1,000 in the bank. So I think we're in a lot of economic pain right now. Okay, so public health is a great concept. The idea of protecting the health of an entire community. But people don't like it. And they didn't like it back during the second plague pandemic, and they don't like it now because people don't like to be told what to do. And when an epidemic or a pandemic is coming through, people tend to be scared and more anxious, and that makes a lot of people angry. So you get a lot of angry responses to restrictions. All right, screenshot if you want it. So the decline of the second plague pandemic. Remember, it started with the Black Death, but it lasted for hundreds of years. We started seeing outbreaks decline, both in frequency and severity. Why was that? Well, we started getting immunity in people, and evolution selected for people with genes that conferred or gave people resistance or increased survivability. We saw the same thing going on in rats. Rats started to become a little bit resistant to getting the plague. And in addition to that, the brown rat started displacing the black rat. So the black rat had been the most common rat in Europe during this time period when we're talking about living around people and living in people's houses. And the black rats are not very aggressive. They're fine interacting with people. They didn't tend to hide from people as much. But the brown rat was more aggressive. So it was able to chase out the black rat. And it was also less efficient at spreading plague. Partially because it avoided people. Even though it's living in the cities, eating people's garbage, they weren't getting into the houses as much. The black rats were the ancestors of domestic rats. So we have domestic rats today. Some people keep them as pets. They're also used in like medical research, psychology research, and the wild black rats could be tamed. You could train them to do tricks, and people kind of liked having them around. They were pets. And the brown rats, not so much. You can't tame them down. You can't train them to do tricks, and they're not going to let you pet them. Even though I saw your expression, Jerry, rats generally do make pretty good pets. They're affectionate. They're relatively small. They're much cleaner than you think they are. They clean themselves, just like a cat does. So we've got immunity in the people. We've got immunity in rats, in large part because the brown rat displaced the black rat. We're also seeing improvements in nutrition, more diverse crops, and just in general, more food availability. Quarantining did play a role. It certainly did help. In addition, the bacteria evolved. So late in the second pandemic, the strain of Yersinia pestis was milder. It seems to have lost 2 virulence genes. Remember what virulence is?
You know, how much more damage a virus can cause or disease?
Yes, absolutely. So late in the second pandemic, the strain of Yersinia pestis didn't have 2 of the virulence genes that made the Black Death and the early part of the second pandemic so deadly. As a result, the case fatality rate declined. We also had changing climate. Now, unlike nowadays, where the climate is warming, at this point, a couple of things happened. Depopulation meant fields reverted to being forests. That is going to have an effect on the local climate. If you have enough fields reverting to forests, that's going to have a significant effect. And we believe that this depopulation and reforestation actually led to harsher winters in most of Europe. What's gonna be a result of harsh winters?
Less food.
Well, less food, yes, but what's going to happen to the host species and the vector species, the rats and the fleas?
They're gonna go in your houses more often?
Actually, they would die off a lot.
Oh,
So harsher winters means you decrease the population of the rats, you decrease the population of fleas. In fact, the winters got so cold that in London, they used to have winter festivals on the Thames, on the river going through the middle of London, because it would freeze solid. All right, I'm out of space. I'm gonna have to write some more stuff. So screenshot it.
I see rats in the snow all the time.
Yes, but you don't see as many as you would see.
Okay, cheers.
Yeah. There were also changes in housing. So the floors had been mud or dirt. They're now being replaced with concrete. So concrete was developed, and we were able to make surfaces other than dirt for the floors. Thatched roofs were replaced with tile roofs. Thatched roofs provide a lot of space for insects and rodents and lizards and stuff to live. So now we have less space for those creatures to live. Depopulation led to lower population densities. Anytime you lower population densities, you reduce the spread of a disease. Grain storage moved out of the houses. So you weren't keeping grains inside your house, you were keeping them in another building, a barn or some kind of shed. Grain attracts the rodents, rodents bring the fleas, grains move out of the house, rodents move out of the house. And there was an increase in soap, bathing frequency, and the amount of clothing people had. Remember, in the early part of the pandemic, a lot of people might have one outfit and they just wore it constantly until it literally fell off their bodies. Later in the pandemic, we get to a point where people can have more clothes, which means they can clean their clothes, and the fleas are not staying in the clothing because it comes off of the body. So you can reduce the fleas that people are exposed to. In London, in September 1666, there was the Great Fire of London. Wiped out a huge part of the old city of London. And when that old part of London was rebuilt, it was rebuilt with the more modern style, with the tile roofs and the concrete floors. It also killed off a lot of the rats and fleas. So that really reduced cases in London specifically. As a result of that, unfortunately, this inspired other governments to burn tenements, basically poor communities. You're not going to burn the rich people's houses, but you'll burn the poor communities. And this was particularly a major thing in Calcutta, in India, where lots of people were displaced from housing. The whole area was burned to the ground. Some people died in the fires, both in London and Calcutta, but it did reduce plague outbreaks in both locations. Okay, so that's the end of the second plague pandemic. Any other questions on the second plague pandemic? All right, I'm going to clear the screen.
So it ended with fire, like the Bible says?
In some places, yes.
So this was a stroke of luck. So we're lucky we survived. Humanity survived because this was not planned.
The fires?
Yes.
Well, they were just in certain locations.
Right.
There were people in a lot of places other than London and Calcutta.
True.
Yeah. But yes, there is always a level of luck involved in surviving pandemics. And pandemics have certainly wiped out whole communities in the past, whole civilizations. When we think about other animal species, some of them have been wiped out by pandemics as well. Okay, basically, now I want to talk about the plague since the second plague pandemic. The third plague pandemic began in Yunnan, China in 1855, and it lasted until about 1960. So this one was kind of short. The third plague pandemic only lasted about 100 years, and it seemed to actually be two outbreaks that kind of occurred overlapping. So the first one was bubonic. The second one was pneumonic, and they were genetically distinct. So when we look at these maps kind of show the two different overlapping pandemics that are combined in the third plague pandemic. So the first one starts here in China, spreads within China, Mongolia, Japan. It does come to San Francisco. It comes to Hawaii, Australia, South Africa, and India. And then the second part of this pandemic starts in India and spreads again to parts of Africa, parts of Europe, and South America. So the first wave, we'll just call it the first wave, primarily affected China and India, and it killed more than 12 million people, mostly in India. So it wasn't as bad as the second plague pandemic. Still pretty darn bad. And outbreaks occurred around the world. In San Francisco, it arrived in 1900. The government denied that it was happening because of economic concerns. The beginning of this wave is associated with a rebellion in China, which started with racial tensions and led to a multi-ethnic insurgency against the Chinese government. This was called the Panthay Rebellion. And, you know, what happens when there's a rebellion? Troop movements, refugees moving around, and what could have been a local outbreak that probably would have just died out spreads. All right, good time for a screenshot. In India at this time, India was under British colonial rule. So the British were in charge in India at this time period. So the British enacted legislation, doing all the things that public health tries to do: quarantines, isolation, travel restrictions, and not so helpfully, exclusion of traditional medical practices. Traditional medical practices may or may not have helped. There was a special plague committee that was supported by the British military. These actions helped trigger the early independence movement in India. Anytime you start suppressing the local culture, you're going to get rebellion going on. And supporting traditional medical practices, you're going to suppress the local culture. We're going to talk a little tiny bit more about the British rule in India when we talk about malaria, which is our next disease. All right, we're going to go a little bit more into science. So screenshot this and we'll get some science on. And we'll start with Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. He discovered that bacteria can cause disease. So before this time, bacteria had been discovered, but nobody knew that for sure that it was causing disease. Bacteria had been associated with disease, but it was thought that disease caused bacteria, not the reverse. So one of the things that Pasteur did was he was able to develop what are called sterile techniques. So if you put a culture, a solution, a liquid with nutrients in it and sit it out on the counter, you're going to get bacteria growing in it. He created these specialized flasks that had what's called a swan neck, and he would boil them and not get any bacterial growth. So basically he was killing off the bacteria in these flasks. This swan neck allowed gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and that sort of stuff to move between the inside and the outside of the flask. But it's very, very hard for a bacteria. You can get in the front end of the flask, but they're not going to easily crawl up this neck and then back down to food. Bacteria need to reproduce in order to spread, and there's no food here. So you're not going to get a lot of bacteria in here. Now, he also showed that if you boil this solution and break the neck off, you are going to get growth. So he showed that it wasn't just the boiling process that caused no growth. It was boiling and not letting new bacteria in. And the sterile technique allowed growth of what we call pure cultures, which means only one species or type of bacteria. If you just leave it out on the bench, you're going to get lots of different things growing in it. Bacteria, viruses, all kinds, fungi, all kinds of stuff growing. This technique allowed you to isolate one bacteria and grow lots and lots and lots of it. And when you can isolate and grow up one bacteria, you can inject one bacteria, one species or type, into animals and see if it causes disease. So this is kind of the first half of showing that bacteria cause disease. Pasteur's techniques are where we get the term pasteurization, which we use, it's a process we use to sterilize milk. Because if you don't sterilize milk, you can get bacterial growth and it can make people very, very sick. Okay, screenshot this part. The second part of this Robert Koch and Koch's postulates. So Koch learned how to grow bacteria and how to stain them and see them under a microscope. So he learned these techniques, and after learning sterile techniques, he came up with this idea of these 5 postulates or 5 steps that had to be done to show that a particular organism caused a particular disease. Step 1, isolate agent from someone or an animal that's sick. So you can isolate a specific strain or type of, basically he was working with bacteria. We could also do this with viruses nowadays. Grow in pure culture. So you're increasing population of that one bacteria. Then you inject it into healthy animals. If it's disease causing, the healthy animal gets sick. But to prove that it's that bacteria, you have to be able to re-isolate the same strain or type of bacteria from the sick animal. So it's not enough to find a sick animal, isolate a strain of bacteria, and grow it up. You have to show that it will cause disease in a healthy animal, and then that the bacteria persists. It's in that newly sick animal. So it's not just a coincidence that the animal got sick. Like, let's say with us, we have E. coli in our stomachs. If you were to isolate E. coli from somebody who was sick, grow it up, inject it into somebody else, and they come down with COVID, just coincidentally, you've got to be able to re-isolate that E. coli from the person who's now sick with COVID. So when we think about these postulates, they work pretty good with bacteria, but there are some problems. What kind of problems can you guys see with these postulates? Jerry, you're muted.
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Where's Nate at when you need him, you know?
Yeah. He's not here today, unfortunately.
Nah. We're like the 1-2 punch, you know?
Yes, yes. What if the disease is caused by a virus?
Right.
We cannot grow viruses in
They
your
want
culture.
most, right.
They have to have cells to grow in. What if it's a genetic disease? Or it's caused by a toxin or a poison in the environment? You can't find those using Cox postulates. What if the bacteria only makes 25% of the animals that it's injected into sick? What if 75% of the animals have resistance? So go ahead, Jerry.
It's not a very accurate way.
It's not a very accurate way. At the time, it was a real major breakthrough. But there are certainly a lot of cases where this is not going to work. Okay, screenshot if you want it. Okay, so we've started understanding bacteria. We've got an understanding that bacteria cause diseases. And during this third plague pandemic, we finally find the specific bacteria that causes the plague. We discover Yersinia pestis. There were two rival labs that were looking for the bacteria that causes plague. They were working in China. On the left, we've got a picture. Kidisato Shibasaburo, I'm probably butchering that name. He was a Japanese physician. He studied under Koch of Koch's postulates, and he was working in Tokyo. He found a bacteria in plague victims that caused disease in mice. So great. He thinks he's got the right bacteria. The competition was Alexandre Yersin, a student of Pasteur, French, who was working in Hong Kong, made the same discovery, found a bacteria that caused plague in mice. Now, Kidisato, being a local, had arranged so that all of the bodies that came into the morgue were reserved for him. He was the only one who could try and get bacteria out of them. Yersin had to bribe morgue attendants to get any samples. And he did. Kitasato found the bacteria almost a week before Yersin, so really, really close in time. And he published first. But he was rushing because he knew Yersin was hot on his heels. And his description was not that great. His samples turned out to be contaminated, and he had to retract his findings. So Yersin gets the credit because he's the one who published first.
Hence the name.
Hence the name Yersinia pestis. Yep. Now, what has happened since the third plague pandemic? Since the 1960s. Plague is endemic in several places. What is endemic? Have you guys heard that word before?
It's staying around forever, pretty much.
Pretty much, yeah. Naturally occurring, and pretty much always there.
Like chicken pox?
Like chicken pox, exactly. So the red areas on this map show where plague occurs in wild animals. So Mongolia, lots of different places in China, some places in India. Here we're getting into the Middle East, some parts of Africa, Madagascar, Western North America, a few places in South America. So if you go to these areas and you collect rodents, you will find some that are infected with plague. There are around 1,000 to 3,000 cases per year, every year worldwide. Most are bubonic, which of course is the least deadly, right? In the US, in the past, in the first 2 decades of this century, so we don't have data from 2020 or later, but for the decades before 2020, there were between 1 and 17 cases per year. And during this whole time, during 2 decades, only 12 deaths. So much, much lower case fatality rate. In large part, that's because we have antibiotics, and antibiotics largely work against the plague. Not completely, but they do.
That 1 to 3,000 is worldwide?
Yes.
Okay.
So antibiotics and supportive therapy are very useful. Even so, the case fatality rate nowadays for bubonic is about 15%. Septicemic is about 40%. Remember, it was nearly 100% during the Black Death. And it's still nearly 100% for pneumonic. So pneumonic is still incredibly deadly.
Because it happens so fast, right? Isn't it like 48 hours with pneumonic?
Yes, yes. You can be dead in 2 days, easy.
Jesus.
In 2017, there was an outbreak in Madagascar with 2,300 cases and 200 deaths. So almost all of the normal worldwide number of cases occurred just in Madagascar in 2017. So they had a really bad outbreak there.
It's a lot of forests in Madagascar, and there's a lot of like species that are only there and nowhere else as well.
Yep.
And they can't leave. It's like baby Australia in that
Yes.
sense.
Okay, so that is what's been going on since the third plague pandemic. So I want to wrap up with a little bit of a review of the kinds of things we've been talking about when we've been going through the plague. So if you haven't taken a screenshot, go ahead. All right. So, reviewing the second plague pandemic. Causes. What were our causes?
Oh, big cities.
Yeah. Cities.
Well, large settlements of people, I guess is the better way to say it.
Increased population densities. Yep.
Was that when Europe got a bit hotter?
It was after Europe started cooling off again. So yes, that's when there was widespread malnutrition and starvation in Europe. And actually, probably in China too. What else were we seeing at this time period?
The worst part of it all, travel.
Travel.
Travel and trade, which is, one of the same, I guess.
Yep, people moving around. So we see the same kinds of things over and over and over again. What kinds of effects did this have on society? Not so much on individuals, but on populations and society in general. Yeah, we really need Nate here today.
Yeah, right, Nate. All the burden. Well, I say, unemployment went up. People stopped working as much.
Well, not so much unemployment. But significantly reduced populations. Half of Europe pretty much died in 5 years.
Wow, man.
About a third of the Middle East population was lost. And we know there were similar declines in China, probably also in Africa and India. We don't have great documentation for Africa and India. We see widespread discrimination.
Abandonment of children.
Abandonment of children, so breakdown of families. The discrimination was largely against Jewish people and women. We also see the origin of public health, which included quarantines.
The
brand new
magistrate
concept.
guy,
Huh?
the magistrate, the health magistrates.
The health magistrates, yes. Cleaner streets. We didn't really talk about that, but cleaning the streets became a much more common thing. You see changes in funeral practices, including lots of mass graves and lots of people who were in fear for their souls because They couldn't get last rites. There weren't enough priests going around. And of course, there were a bunch of rebellions that occurred as a result of a lot of these restrictions by the public health magistrates. And it ended because of increased hygiene, having multiple outfits, lower population density, changes in the rodents. Remember the brown rat replacing the black rat.
One's is more aggressive, but more shy as well. That's
Yes.
an ironic coupling of characteristics.
Yeah, they're more aggressive with other rats, but they avoid people. We start seeing immunity or greater ability to survive in the people. We see changes in the climate. It got colder. We killed off the fleas and the rats. Changes in the housing to make it less friendly for rodents, the tile roofs, the concrete floors. We also saw a lot of misunderstandings of what was going on, things that we still kind of hear about today. The imbalance of humors. We still have people today who talk about you're sick because something's out of balance. Believe it or not, there are still people who go in for bloodletting. Crystals to ward off disease. And snake oil, which used to originally contain parts of snakes. So all of this is kind of a lot of stuff that we've talked about. Are there any questions about any of this part? So for the biology part, it's bacterial, Yersinia pestis. There are the three forms. And there's different levels of case fatality rate for those and different symptoms. We have modern treatments. I'm also going to ask you to remember Cox postulates. Even though they're imperfect, they work pretty good. So that's the biology I want you to make sure you take from this. Okay, that's the end of plague. And now we've lost Jerry too.
Oh no, I was just, when I take a note, my screen goes black. I don't know why, it's weird.
Okay.
I took a note, look more into cost postulates.
Okay. All right. So everybody take a deep breath, stretch. Plague is a big, big topic. We're done with it. But we're going to move on to something even deadlier.
What?
Yeah. Yeah. There are diseases deadlier than plague. And so let's get some perspective here. COVID has killed between 6 and 20 million worldwide. We don't have a good number. That's a really big range. In the US, about 1 out of every 400 Americans. I, I, I had to do the math like 4 or 5 times because it blew my mind that it was that many. But we've got about 1 million confirmed COVID deaths and 320 million Americans.
Wow.
Julia, go ahead.
So with I was never aware that like malaria was ever like, I mean, I know like people got it and it was bad, but I was never aware that it was like classified as like a pandemic.
That's because it's so constant. We tend to forget about things that are just a constant problem.
Does it not affect Americans as much as other parts of the world?
And it doesn't affect Americans as much as other parts of the world. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Isn't it like mainly Africa?
So that's why we don't care about it.
Yeah, that's why we don't care about it. Mainly, most of the malaria deaths are in Africa.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
AIDS, we've lost 36 million people, roughly. Plague, 240 million people, looking at multiple plague pandemics. The Black Death accounts for almost half of that total. That's that couple of years time period. Smallpox, 500 million. The 1918 flu, 50 million. So more than AIDS, but less than any of these others.
But that was short though, the 1918 flu. So that was big deal.
Yes, yes. Tuberculosis, 1 billion. I didn't realize this until I was pulling this slide together. I didn't realize tuberculosis was that big. It's huge. Any guesses on where malaria falls?
It's more than that? Oh man, I don't even know.
Okay.
2.5. Oh, damn.
50? How many? This is since the dawn of time then.
But there's not even, oh, you're talking about like, I'm so stupid. I was going to be like, there's only 7 billion people in the world.
No, this is over the past probably 100,000 years. So pretty much since we've become humans, we've been battling malaria.
Jeez.
Even today, between 500,000 and 1 million people die every year from malaria.
Jeez. When I watch like say movies from like the early 1900s, they talk about it a lot when they're going to Africa. Hopefully he doesn't have malaria. I didn't understand it was this deadly or it ravaged us this much.
Yes, yes.
Just another reason to hate mosquitoes.
Which are coming back in like a month. That's the only reason I like the winter, because there's no flies or mosquitoes.
Okay. I'm going to read you a quote, slightly modified quote from a guy named Paul Russell that is kind of using flowery language to talk about malaria. Man plows the sea like a leviathan. He soars through the air like an eagle. Their voice circles the world in a moment. Her eyes pierce the heavens. They move mountains. He makes the desert to bloom. He has planted her flag at the North Pole and the South. Yet millions of men each year are destroyed because they fail to outwit a mosquito. So we've only got like 4 minutes left in class. We're not going to start malaria today.
What?
Oh, do you really want to get
I
started?
mean, so can you give me like a little quick overview? This is super interesting.
Jerry,
To
let
me.
it go.
All right, guys. All right. Next week. What is today? Today's
It's
Tuesday?
just
No, Thursday.
Thursday. You only have to wait 2 days, Jerry.
All right, I'll wait. Sorry, guys.
Okay. Any other questions? Nothing?
So no class next Thursday?
Next Tuesday.
Tuesday. Okay. All right. Cheers.
I'm looking for something on tuberculosis, since it turns out to be a lot deadlier than I realized. All right, everybody have a good week, and or good couple of days. I'll see you on Thursday. Hi, Nate. Sorry we missed you today. Oh, I stopped the recording. No, I didn't. Well, if I'm still recording, sorry we missed you today. I hope you're feeling better.